Hello, everybody. I'm Brian Levine, and welcome to the Gould Standard. We're here again for the Glenn Gould Foundation, bringing you conversations with some of the most remarkable people from all across the world of the arts. But first, while you're stopping by under our flagrantly flickering piano sign, please take a moment to press like, share, and subscribe. And while you're at it, be sure to check out our past programs with the likes of Wynton Marsalis, Laurie Anderson, Neil Gaiman, Philippe Stark, Ai Weiwei, Petula Clark, Viggo Mortensen, Hilary Hahn, Nare Sol, Cory Doctorow, and many more. But as they say in the infomercials, but wait, there's more. We'd love you to visit us at our website, glenngould.ca. And when you're there, if you like our program, please click the donate button and support the work of the Glenn Gould Foundation. We'd be proud and honored to have you as a supporter. Our guest today is none other than Rick Beato, a man who literally lives and breathes music. He's a songwriter, a multi-instrumentalist, sound engineer, producer, audio engineer, and he's been a university lecturer, but he's still an educator, even though not in the institutional world. He owns Black Dog Sound Studios in Stone Mountain, Georgia. But these days, he's best known as one of the world's most successful YouTubers in the music realm, beginning with his Everything Music series in 2015. These days, he has 4.5 million subscribers to his channel, 1 million followers on YouTube, and on YouTube, he has had over 1.5 billion, that's billion with a B, views. His videos feature interviews with many of the musical legends of our time, analysis, opinion, and the occasional cranky rant. What comes through, however, in every minute of his shows is an exuberant, joyful love of music, an insatiable desire to share that joy and his encyclopedic knowledge with his viewers. Rick, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Brian. Great to be here.
Now, regular viewers of your channel probably associate you mostly with rock and pop music, but jazz has a special place among your early influences. Can you tell us a bit about how all that got started for you?
So I actually started as a classical musician on the cello when I was in third grade. And my dad was a huge jazz listener. So my mom loved classical music and listened to that all the time, and my dad listened to jazz. So both, and then of course I have 6 siblings, and they were listening to all different types of music. So I was really exposed to a lot of different genres of music early in life. But I played the bass. I mean, I have an undergraduate degree in classical bass and a master's in jazz guitar. And I pursued both the bass and the guitar at the same time, really starting seriously in probably 8th grade or so when I was 14. I took up the guitar and I started practicing all the time, and I got obsessed with rock music and jazz. And but my love of classical music is, if you ask me what I listen to most, probably classical music. As far as even today, I would say I probably lean more towards listening to classical music than anything.
And I'm gonna guess that when you were in school, ensemble playing was a big part of what inspired you.
Yes, I played in the orchestra. During my undergraduate degree, I played orchestra. I played bass in the orchestra. When my undergrad was at Ithaca College, my master's degree was at New England Conservatory. And when I was at New England, most of my ensemble playing was all in jazz groups, jazz combos. And I love ensemble playing. That's something that I miss these days. I don't, unless I'm reading a score, I don't get to read music very often because it doesn't. It's not part of many of my episodes, because when my channel got so big, there's so few people that actually can read. I end up doing most of my demonstrations as playing demonstrations, so they can enjoy them in that way.
Well, that's something that I want to get to is the changes in the musical preparation of artists these days. But let's say that for a little later. You tell a story about being introduced to Bach's Brandenburg Concerto Number 3 as being kind of one of those aha moments. What was that like? I mean, did you know the music before, or was it something that was fresh for you?
I had heard Bach before, things that my mom would listen to on TV, on public PBS or whatever the thing was. We had WXXI in Rochester. And you would play, when I was playing the cello, played some simplified versions of Bach pieces. But it wasn't until the summer after sixth grade that I played in this ensemble, as I told the story in a video. And I moved from cello to bass, and the Brandenburg Concerto Number 3 in G major was one of the pieces that we performed. And when I listened to the music, I got the Brandenburg Concertos album from the Fairport Public Library, and I started listening to them, and it changed my life forever. I couldn't believe that there was music that beautiful. It just blew me away.
Yeah, it's of course great because there's so much independence of the line, so you actually have something real to do rather than just playing block chords or anything like that.
Right.
Yeah, you've got a real moving line there. So I'm really interested about being a kid from Rochester, going to Ithaca College, which is not far away, but
Not far.
ever have a temptation to go to Eastman?
They didn't have a guitar program at the time at Eastman. So I did take lessons in the summer times. Gene Bertoncini was one of the guitarists, the jazz guitarist. And then Steve Brown taught one summer there, who was the professor at Ithaca College, which is one of the reasons why I went to Ithaca. Because I took a short, I guess, summer semester with Steve. One year was Gene, and then 1 year was Steve. And then, but when I went to Ithaca, the first day I got there, I went to the bass instructor, and I said, I played first chair in my high school orchestra, and I'd like to keep playing bass. And he said, well, can you? He picked up his bass, and he had me sight read, and he's like, why don't you be a bass major instead of a guitar major? And I thought, well, can I play an orchestra? And he said, absolutely. And so I said, okay. And I switched my major from guitar to bass on the first day of school at Ithaca.
Right. So this is a question only for bass players who are doing classical, but there isn't a big solo repertoire. So how much time did you spend on the Bottesini concerto?
I've spent some time, definitely. It's funny because a lot of my friends that were jazz majors wondered why I didn't play jazz bass. And yet I played jazz guitar, and I always saw these as separate things. And I really enjoyed ensemble playing in the orchestra, or even in smaller groups if there were chamber orchestras that had bass parts in them. And honestly, Brian, that's one of the things that I miss at this point in my life. I'm 62, and I have a bass, and I would love to do some ensemble playing again. Well, I'm still capable of doing it.
Okay, listeners, if you're near Atlanta, that was, I think, a casting call. Maybe an opportunity to do some sextets, septets, and other repertoire, and transcriptions. We love transcriptions. Yeah. Now, one of the things that comes across on your YouTube channel is a kind of a fearless determination. You didn't get into Ithaca easily. And once you got through it and actually were teaching at Ithaca, you gave it all up, kind of like that. So, is this just a peculiarity of your personality, or just did you want those things so badly that nothing was going to stop in your way?
Probably both.
Yeah.
When you teach, I taught at Ithaca from 87 to 92, and And, when I look at the other professors, I thought, okay, I could be 60 years old and teaching here still. And I thought, that can't be all of what my life is at this point. I want to do other things. I want to play different types of music. And I had gotten signed to a publishing deal with Polygram Publishing, which enabled me to take a leap of faith and leave my secure college teaching job and go try to make it as a songwriter, which I had kind of failed at first, and then didn't fail at, but then ended up in music production, which is probably where I was the most successful.
Right.
Which ended up leading to YouTube.
Yeah, but that failed at was, let's not gloss over. That was a couple of pretty hard years of paying your dues, right?
Yes. Yeah, I really struggled for the 2 years after I left Ithaca. I tried to make it. I got really in debt. I had to move home with my parents and then start out again from scratch, and ended up down here in Atlanta in 1994 and kind of rebuilt my life. I've been here, so it's been here almost 30 years. It'll be 30 years next month that I've been here.
And becoming a producer, first of all, it's an enormously creative job, especially in the rock world. You're basically, in many ways, either a co-creator and in some cases an actual creator of the album. Not to denigrate the role of the people in front of the microphones, but the producer has an enormous amount of influence on the end product, as does the mixer and so on. How did you decide this was, how did you get into it? What was the first opportunity to move from in front of the mic or writing the songs to standing behind the monitors and giving feedback to the artists out in the studio?
Well, I always enjoyed the recording process. I loved being in the studio. I loved working on songs, even though I never understood what the gear did. I would play on records, my own records, other people's records. They'd ask me to come and play, but I never mic'd anything up. I never ran the mixing console. And I was in a band that had gotten signed to a record deal, and we had a few months until our record came out. And my lawyer, Reed, who's still my lawyer, good friend of mine, I said to him, we had blown our entire budget, so we had no salaries to live on, and I had to get a job before our record came out. And he said, why don't you produce some bands? And I was like, I don't know about that. I don't really know much about the production process. He's like, what are you talking about? You've been in the studio so many times. So I went to a friend's studio. My lawyer, Reed, connected me with a band, and I started producing, and I learned the recording process in the meantime. I basically taught myself or asked questions of other people that worked at the studios I worked at. And that was, and I found that to be one of the most interesting things was that I had ever done is actually the recording, how to mic things, how microphones work, how mic pre's work, what understanding acoustics, how to mic a piano for a rock song, how to mic a piano for jazz, for classical music, how to use room mics. All that stuff is absolutely fascinating. And honestly, Brian, to this day, it's one of my favorite things to do I love the engineering, the mixing part of it. There's all these skills that I've acquired through my lifetime of playing all different styles of music. And I think that they come together in the production part of it. But I enjoy a lot of the technical things too, of actually getting great sounds. That's to me so interesting. And
of course, if you're the artist, you sort of pour it out in the studio and then you go back if it doesn't sound good. That's really disappointing. It's like putting a pin in a balloon.
Right. Yeah, nothing worse than ruining someone's record.
Which you had done to you.
Which I had done to me. I don't like to harp on it too much. I was in a band, and the producer that we worked with, the results weren't stellar. It was kind of a disaster. And that's really one of the things that's why I was hesitant to get into it at first. But I also had this idea of, I don't want this to ever happen to someone else. So there were two sides of that.
Yeah. Well, also, you have to have thought, I can't possibly be this bad. So.
Well, that's true. That's kind of like when I started on YouTube. I thought, well, someone's got to be successful. Why couldn't it be me?
Right. What's really striking about this is you don't seem to have set out, on day one of your life or even your professional life with a master plan, that I'm going to be, at this age, I'm going to be here. At this age, I'm going to be here. And at the end of the day, I'm going to be sitting back, letting the royalties roll in, enjoying a margarita, on the Costa del Sol, none of that stuff. You basically were kind of wandering and exploring every step of the way, right?
Yes, I like trying new things. I like going in different directions with my career. I like going to different directions with my YouTube channel. Some of my biggest videos are about odd things. The John Dowland video that I did, or it's you never know what's going to connect with people. And I make videos on YouTube about things I'm interested in, and I'm interested in an awful lot of things, a lot of different types of music, different instruments, from music theory to ear training to music production to criticism or critiques of contemporary music or historic music. I made a video. I went to Leipzig in 2019 or 2018. I made a video on Bach, and
it's a beautiful video.
Thank you. And I was supposed to go this year. I did a show or last year or was it this year? I can't even remember the year. I did a show in Germany, in Berlin. I think it was last October. Now I can't even remember what year it is. And I was scheduled to fly into Vienna. I was going to do a Mozart video and a Beethoven video. I was going to go to Bonn. I was going to go to Vienna. I was going to go to Salzburg, and do similar videos like I did on Bach. But I'd had some laser surgery in my eye, and I couldn't carry anything over 10 pounds, so I had to shorten my trip just to go over and do the gig. But I plan on returning to Germany to make these videos.
That'll be fantastic. Now you relate on your channel how you had your first hit record at age 52. So that's definitely paying your dues. And after years of all this hard work, creating your own studio, working with so many other people, writing your songs, honing your skills, you decide to stop producing. Huh? Like, why?
Well, at the end of 2015, I made this video with my son Dylan that I had a guy in the studio that was a singer that my son Dylan has insanely good perfect pitch. And I was showing my friend Shane, I was playing these clusters and things like that, and Dylan was naming the notes, or if they were chords, he would say what they were. And so Shane said, "Hey, can you make a video so I can play it for my wife Angie?" And I said, "Yeah, I'll make one for you." So I was getting ready to go to a school board. I was on the school board at my kid's school. And I said, "Hey, Dylan, come downstairs. I want to record something." And he says, "No, I don't want to." And I was like, "Come on, it'll just take 1 minute." And so I said to my wife, Nina, I said, "Can you tell Dylan to come downstairs?" "How long is this going to take?" I said, 1 minute. It's like, "Okay, come on, Dylan, go downstairs." So Dylan comes down. He's got a mouthful of candy. And I just put up my iPhone. I was like, "I'm just going to play some chords for you, some single notes, play some chords." And so it was about a minute long. I put it on my Facebook page, and I go to the school board meeting, and I call my friend Shane. I said, "Oh, I put up the video for Angie so she can watch it." He said, "Oh, cool." Then after the school board meeting, he calls me up. He says, "I think it's a viral video." And I said, "What do you mean?" I only had about 30 followers on Facebook. He goes, this got 5,000 views. I said, is that a viral video? I thought viral videos had millions of views. He said, you wait. And then the next day it had 22,000 in the morning. He calls me up. And then by the next night it had millions. And it got millions and millions of views. And I got all these professors from universities. Dylan was naming these really complex chords, E add 9 over F major, C augmented over D flat augmented, all these crazy things that it was the music theory part of it. Like, how can this 8-year-old kid, it's one thing to have perfect pitch. How does he know what all these chords are? Like, how can he recognize them? So that kind of got my, if you ask my son Dylan, he said, without me, you wouldn't have a YouTube channel.
So where's my cut?
If people saw him now, Brian, they wouldn't know. Dylan's, taller than me. He's got a beard, mustache, and they would never recognize him. I keep trying to get him back on a video, but he won't do it.
But his pitch is still as good?
Yes. Oh, it's phenomenal.
That's great. That's great. So that sounds like it was the gateway to starting a channel.
Yeah. So that was on Facebook, and then about 6 months, and I started doing some teaching videos, because a lot of people, I got people from well-known musicians, people from conservatories wrote me, how did you teach him? How did he recognize these chords? How did he learn music theory at 8 years old? So I would go on and do these live streams, and I'd start teaching things, little ear training things, and I would teach music theory. And I would do some sophisticated videos like that. But if I played any music, the videos started getting blocked by Facebook. And one of my friends, who was an intern here, said, you should try YouTube. And I said, nobody's going to watch a white-haired guy on YouTube. And he said, no, I'm telling you, it's going to work. So I started, all my early videos are really sophisticated film scoring, music theory, modes, ear training. And I went over a lot of the things that I had worked on with Dylan, because I would, not just modes of the major scale and the melodic minor and the harmonic minor, but some odd scales, harmonic major scale, double harmonic major scale, and these modes that people had never heard of before. And I would do breakdowns of film composers. I do recreations of little film score cues and talk about them. And I do a score reduction to a piano reduction of these things, and I would talk about them, talk about the theory of what they were using, the motifs, how they were developed, and that's really how I started my channel. My channel was no rock music at all for about 18 months. I never did a video on any rock music. It was all on improvisation. It was classical music and jazz. So, which is funny, because then later on, when my channel really got big, it was from doing the things that I had made a living doing, more of the production and the song breakdowns.
Well, having been in the classical music business, at its peak during the CD revolution, it was 1.75% of record sales. So it kind of tells you where it is. But I assume, I didn't know your channel then, so I didn't know the numbers, but I'm going to guess you probably got 10 or 20,000 followers in that phase.
Okay, so no, I actually had 200,000 followers.
Well, there you go.
So I found a way to, and it was funny, because I did whiteboard lectures. Nobody did. It seems like an absurd thing to do whiteboard lectures on music theory, and that the videos would actually do well. But I have videos that have millions of views that are whiteboard lectures, essentially. And I do whiteboard lectures on things like how compression works, how equalization works, how do you EQ these different instruments, where to place and I would draw on the whiteboard. Then I would incorporate examples for people to hear, and like being in a classroom.
Yeah, yeah. Well, as the channel evolved, you began to develop some pretty terrific regular features. One of my favorite is what makes this song great. Where what I like about it is that although you don't go necessarily as far as getting the whiteboard out for lighter shade of pale or whatever, the you do serious analysis. You look at the harmonic structure, you look at the time signatures, you look at the instrumentation, the mix, all of those things, rather than just saying, I love it because it makes me feel so tranquil and peaceful, or, it really gets my blood pumping, I mean, that's fine. There's a million channels where they do that. But to actually understand that these things, I mean, one of the things that, when I was in the business, I always thought would be good to try to counteract is this image that the average music listener, record buyer in those days has, is that this thing kind of descends from the heavens whole, right?
Yes.
They have no idea what went into making it, how many professionals go through it, how much training and education, how complex music is. Even the simplest music is highly complex.
Yes.
Just to get to today's tuning took, 1,000 years?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, literally.
And a lot of great minds. We don't know the name Werkmeister today, but he was a big dude back in the, 1600s. Anyway, so the idea of bringing that level of analysis to, songs that would be, part of everyone's playlist, part of everyone's sort of greatest hits list. Were you convinced from the outset that that was going to work, or did you just sort of discover it?
I experimented on a live stream. I have a second channel, Rick Beato 2, that I never told anyone about, that I had a few thousand followers, and I would go on there to try new ideas at night and never list the videos. I never put descriptions in or anything like that. And I had 100 people that would get on. And one night I played some multi-track of a song, and I talked about it, and everybody was saying that everybody enjoyed it. And then my intern, Rhett, that had told me to start my channel, was watching, and he said, oh, you should do that on your main channel, do these song breakdowns. And I came up with the idea of what makes this song great, and I did it, and it was incredibly successful.
And I'm sure you've got like a list in your mind for probably about the next 10 years of the songs you still want to take on. But so what does make a song great? The late science fiction writer Theodore Sturgeon had a famous law, which is 90% of everything is crap. And I'm thinking, actually, maybe he was a little too optimistic. It's probably higher than 90%.
Yeah. 96%, I like to say.
Yeah. But the thing is, I actually believe that nobody, or at least virtually nobody, sets out to make crap. Like, they study, they work, they go without, and they don't want to do lousy work. But clearly there are some elements that set a run-of-the-mill song apart from the ones that kind of live forever and take a permanent place in your consciousness, your memory, your emotional life. Or just like plain old knock us on our asses. Have you been able to identify certain elements in common from your exploration of these great pieces of music?
Yeah, I think that the element of surprise, when I interviewed Sting, his music uses a lot of upper extensions, notes that are not in the chord, non-chord tones, but scale tones, and a lot of what you might consider modal writing, for example. Like we'll use the flat 6 on a minor chord as a dissonance against the 5th, and uses the 13th on minor chords, and uses sharp 4s on major chords, things like that jazz musicians would do, or it's in classical music as well. I was just listening to the Bach Cantata number 54. My favorite version is Glenn Gould's It's from 1962. It was from, I believe, August, with Russell Oberlin singing the countertenor part, which is one of my absolute favorite versions of the of that piece. And the dissonances
with the weird hybrid piano, the way he called
with
it,
a weird hybrid
right.
harpsichord piano. I don't know what
tax in the felts.
Yes, and it's a wonderful version of it. The tempo. A lot of times, you'll hear the piece performed and the tempo is too fast, and you cannot soak in the harmony. Now, when Glenn conducted it, and played along, I always think to myself that he's just improvising along on it as he's conducting, but the tempo is absolutely perfect on it, and it really brings out the richness of the harmony and the dissonances. And he talks about the opening chord that you would not find anything of that that level of dissonance for 150 years or so. And those elements, those haunting tones, surprise notes, upper extensions, whatever you want to call them, sting like the term surprise notes. And you find that those things in the choruses of songs, in the verses of the songs, the Beatles did them all the time. Sting does them. Joni Mitchell did them, or does them. That's just something that for songs that become ones that you want to come back to, they have those elements in them right at the right time, on the right lyric, and it makes people want to listen to them over and over.
Right. And if someone is writing and really understands harmony, they use some of those changes, not just to be novel or different, but because it packs an emotional punch. It basically says, this is the moment in the song, this is the spot in the lyrics that, where my heart broke, where my relationship ended, where I discovered my true bliss. All of that happens through harmony. And this is actually something that a lot of people, it's amazing how many people, when they listen to music, think that the only thing in music is the melody. The melody is important. Of course, it's really important. But the real language of music in the Western world, is the language of harmony, and how the harmony moves and changes, and how people begin to experiment and move away from what seemed like a stable, fixed set of rules to it's one of the things that Beethoven was really, really a master at, and it's also interesting how a single chord, can change musical perception. You did one on James Bond, and I would also throw in Wagner and the Tristan chord, which basically you could say kind of changed the course of music for about the next 100 years. It's this oddly dissonant chord at the start of his sort of breakaway opera, Tristan and Isolde, which is about this unrequited love that basically never is consummated until 5 hours later, and then the chord resolves. So that chord in that section at the end of the opera, that's usually called the love death, because it's a love so powerful that literally the two lovers die after experiencing the height of their passion. Some people have called it the greatest orgasm in the history of music. But regardless, it's a chord. One chord can have that much power.
Yeah, the Rite of Spring, that one chord.
Yes.
In there. There's a lot of examples in music. The Bach one, to me, was when Glenn states that chord on the piano, and he starts playing, da 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 da, but the beautiful harmony of that sets up the mood and the intensity of it. And when I've interviewed composers, I interviewed Thomas Newman, who's one of my favorite film composers.
It's a great interview.
And thank you. And his sense of harmony is so unique, and you really, it's interesting because it's one of the few places that you hear beautiful harmony is in film composing, in John Williams and Thomas Newman and the James Newton Howard and Howard Shore, just all these great composers that come out of the tradition that were music on paper composers. And I always gravitated towards that. I love, late romantic, impressionistic music, 20th century music. I was a fan of Stravinsky and Schoenberg and Webern and Berg and Debussy and as well as all the romantic composers, Schumann, Schubert, Chopin, Beethoven. And it's just, there's so few places that you can go to hear original music. You have to go to soundtracks, and nowadays so many soundtracks nowadays are just based on sound effects, and they don't have the detailed writing like in a John Williams, fanfare that, like in the end of E.T. or something like that. You rarely hear things like that actually have motifs and that develop ideas that have these the leitmotifs that follow characters and things like that. And it's I don't know, but harmony is just so important. I got on a tangent there, but harmony is so important for to bring emotion to music. It's not just the melody; it's the relationship between the melody and the harmony.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, if you strip out the harmony and just play the melody, it loses essentially all of its emotional appeal. It becomes kind of a nursery rhyme kind of experience often. Of course, the harmony is also sometimes implicit in the melody. So
true,
they don't exist without each other. Well, you touched on film music, and actually that was something that I had about 8 questions forward. So I just fast forwarded to it because I actually did think that conversation with Thomas Newman was outstanding. And also your tribute to John Williams. I've had the pleasure of doing podcasts with Howard Shore and also Harry Gregson Williams, who's kind of a protege of Hans Zimmer. And, he comes out of the English choral tradition, which is really interesting. So when he did his Ridley Scott film on the Crusades, The Holy City, I think it's called, there's an enormous amount of that influence in the writing. But what I've always thought is that, everyone says, that the most important development in 20th century music was the emergence of jazz. And I would second that. But I think the second most important was the creation of film music.
Absolutely.
It's a genre unto itself that, because it always accompanies, most people don't listen to it by itself, with the exception of really mega hits like, Star Wars and so on. But one of the things that I really admire about film music and film music composers is sort of 4 different attributes. One is their ability to build on and extend the styles of the past. That would be a good example would be John Williams, or going back farther, Gould.
Gould, yep.
Yep. Second, bringing the more challenging musical styles of contemporary music, like 12-tone music, to a wide audience. Jerry Goldsmith did that a lot.
Yep.
To create a unique style of their own that you could recognize immediately. Bernard Herrmann would be my classic example. And then finally, and I think this is much the case today, to create excellent music in almost any style, reflecting any nationality, any period in history. And that takes serious chops.
It does. John Williams is one of the few people that can do that really can write in any genre and convincingly. It's not even convincingly. He's able to do it. He hears. I mean, it's really remarkable how gifted he is. It's, but that's the thing about these film composers. The great ones, they can do that.
Yep. The only thing I really wish is the constraints of the film industry. Basically, by the time they're done with one score, they're usually on to another. And because I think that this music, beyond, again, the few mega hits, should have a life in the concert hall, they really ought to force themselves to sit down and write, not just cues, but turn them into extended works that can be played more easily, rather than leaving it to other people to create medleys. I hate medleys. Figure out how to connect the bits together into something that feels like a single piece of music. I actually, not to get sidetracked, but when I first saw the Lord of the Rings, I immediately wanted, for my record label, to create a concert work out of it. And that's when I first met Howard, actually. And I went to see the CEO of then Columbia Artists, which was the big classical music agency. It's no longer exists. And I said, I want to do this. So he said, okay, talk to Howard, see what I care. He didn't take it seriously. And I said, and I did meet with Howard actually the same day, had lunch with him. And I said, look, one of the greatest film scores of all time was Prokofiev's music to Alexander Nevsky, and he turned it into a cantata. We want to turn Lord of the Rings into a cantata. And he said, great, I don't own it. New Line Cinema owns it, talk to them. So that's where it ended. But I think that's a really significant idea because, if people heard, for example, music, like, pick an example of, more contemporary music. Jerry Goldsmith wrote an unbelievably beautiful score to a film called Seconds with Rock Hudson. It's an amazing film, John Frankenheimer film. And he also wrote the music to the first version of Planet of the Apes, which also is a very avant-garde score. These things would be great in a concert hall.
Yeah. I agree. I'm not sure. That's an interesting point that you make about not owning the rights to the music, because these are all work for hire for the most part. Although I don't know if that's the case in John Williams, in his contracts, if he actually owns the scores or not.
I suspect he has enough bargaining power to make that deal.
Yeah. But the use of avant-garde music in film, it's one of the few places that your average listener will accept the type of dissonance that you will find. If it's the Bernard Herrmann's the psycho chord during the slashing scene, that's the X cell, as you would call it, that has 4 chromatic notes spread out in different octaves. That is music like that you would never. A lot of people, your average listener, would not go to a concert hall to hear that because it would be too dissonant for them. But yet in a film with the visual, it makes perfect sense and they will accept these things. And I just find that fascinating. And I think that when I will write little examples when I've made videos of on modes, for example, and I will do a demonstration. I'll write these little pieces that are a minute long in each mode, and I always put visuals. I'll do some type of B-roll or something that go with them because people don't want to look at a black screen, and they will accept music if you can find something that looks appropriate to go with the music. Which is really what film scoring is about. It's like, how do you capture the mood? Thomas Newman, we talked about things like what does a sharp 4 sound like, the Lydian sound, and he uses terms like otherworldly or celestial, and historically, like, I don't know, why do those things sound like that? Why does that mode sound like that? So yeah, I'm a big fan of film music, and I'm glad that I was, I'm glad I'm able to do the things. And when I interviewed Thomas Newman, I couldn't even figure out how do you even connect with a film composer, because it's in the music business, Brian, but it's not really the music business. The film business is so, they use different engineers. They use different it's so self-contained. It's really hard to meet these people.
And nowadays, the successful ones build their own studios because this is, I mean, from the days of, sort of the big Hollywood motion picture factories where they would have an orchestra mostly of like 90 escapees from Nazi Germany. So these are world-class players, but you'd get a guy like Gould or Max Steiner or Alfred Newman, and they would basically write the score out on a piano, more or less by instinct and ear, having seen a cut of the film, get a sense for how long the scenes lasted and how they could get it all to sync up. But basically, there was really no precise syncing technology except what they did live with a big screen projecting in the background over the heads of the players.
Which is pretty amazing.
It is amazing.
Amazing.
And if you hear those scores, they just knock your socks off. By the way, this is going to connect to something else in your work, which is how technology helps and hurts. Nowadays, of course, there may be a temp score, but the composer is expected to produce, either a MIDI or some kind of a sort of a preliminary idea to show the director. The director hopefully has some kind of a musical ear. Famously, Alfred Hitchcock did not, and that's how his relationship with Bernard Herrmann ended when he threw away the score to Torn Curtain. And then, you use samples and you create, something that's feels like an almost complete score. And then, I almost think it's an indulgence to the composer. They go to Abbey Road Studios or Skywalker Sound, get an orchestra together and do it often live. And that's what ends up in the soundtrack after the people who do the sound design and the Foley effects get through mucking with it, and the guy who decides how loud the dialogue is. So that's why you never really realize how good the music is until you get to hear it by itself and by a soundtrack album.
One of the things that I've noticed when I go back to older film scores, when I interviewed Thomas Newman, we talked about the level of how loud the cue was behind the dialogue. In a film like Shawshank Redemption, which has a lot of just music with video overlay and maybe a narration, and then when he scored James Bond, he'd have these beautiful written string piece, and you can barely hear it. Yet when you listen to it on you pull it up on Spotify or listen to it on the CD, you realize how beautiful it is. But
exactly, and also for some films, how much music has been composed, like hours of music. Anyway, just to shift a little bit on the technology front. Now, you regularly look at top 10 songs on Spotify in a given week, and you often find that the artists who are having these huge successes are people you've never heard of. Probably you're never going to hear of them again. And the songs aren't particularly good, or at least not very complex. And this is something you've really had a lot to say about. Among other things, the sort of the negative impact of the algorithm driven streaming process, the progressively lower levels of complexity, the more or less kind of Xerox copy plugins of backing tracks and drum lines and stuff like that, and that I think has gone hand in hand with your sort of lamentations about the decline in the audience for rock and roll, and also there's the amount of rock and roll and the quality of it that's being produced. Is it that making things just overly abundant, so ubiquitous and actually cheapens them?
Yes, I think so. I think that that music is, when you turn on Spotify, it's basically like turning on a water faucet. I made a video about that where I was in my kitchen and I turned on the faucet, and this is Spotify. Just everything you can imagine is on here. You can interrupt the stream of water, and this could be somebody's entire catalog of albums. And was interesting. Had a, I asked my 11-year-old today when I was driving her to school, Layla, I said, Layla, do you talk about music with your friends? And she said, no. And I said, what do you talk about? Video games? She said, no. I said, what do you talk about? She said, we talk about things going on in school, things with students, with the teachers. And what would we talk about? I said, I don't know. I used to talk about music with my friends or sports or things like that. And people don't, she says, no, we never talk about music. And there's a comment that was left on a video that I did a couple days ago. I did a discussion with a good friend of mine, Jim Barber. And it was from a teacher that said that his students never discuss music anymore. And that's a really depressing thought. And so why don't they talk about music? Well, because people, it's so easy to obtain it that it doesn't have the meaning it had when you had to actually pay for it, when you had to go out and get a job and do that. And I said that in one of my videos. I said, music is too easy to make and it's too easy to consume. So, and those are both bad things.
Right. I know that more than one generation, but certainly our generation, has the experience of like traveling to a fairly remote place for the first time in their life to buy a record album. Right. In my case, it was Eaton's department store. I remember this so clearly. We used to watch the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite, and I remember the day that there's sort of the human interest story that ended the broadcast. Will computers ever make music instead of people? There's this amazing new album called Switched On Bach, and this technologist has basically replaced the music of the 18th century with a box that is full of diodes and triodes and transistors, and here's how it sounds. And they did a little interview with then Walter Carlos, now Wendy Carlos, and I thought, that is so cool. I can't believe it. And then, of course, Glenn Gould actually wrote a famous review in High Fidelity magazine calling it the album of the decade, finally voicelating that is really separate because, of course, you could, pan pot it to its own spot and create a completely different sonority. And so I thought, I want that. But I ended up deciding instead that I ought to hear what the music originally sounded like. So I went to Eaton's department store here in Toronto, which is a little ways away from where I lived. In those days, department stores had record departments. They were stocked by what were called rack jobbers. Rack jobbers, there's an extinct species. And I bought a compilation that CBS Records put out called Switched Off Bach, which is actually the first time I heard Glenn Gould play, because they substituted his performances of the Well-Tempered Clavier for the ones on the album. And that was basically the start of the love affair. And then the other sort of monumental moment was when we saved up enough money, usually in high school, to buy our first stereo, right? You probably remembered, like whether you were, delivering newspapers or working in
a grocery store.
Grocery store, I was about to say. And you went and it's like you would talk about, well, let's see, can I afford the Pioneer SX365? Or, and I got to have that dual turntable. There were no CDs, right?
Right.
And like the endless hours, learning how to clean a record. These things
Absolutely.
actually required effort on our part of how you could knock the stylus off your phono cartridge if you accidentally, caused it to skip and crush the cantilever. All of that stuff that we basically grew up with, which meant that it wasn't hard per se, but it was an effort that basically added to the joy of the final experience. When you got the vinyl home, got the cellophane off it, read the program notes if there were program notes, saw the incredible cover art, a foot square, imagine a foot square,
Yep.
something you could actually frame and put on your wall, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now I see that smile, right? So you're reliving that joy.
Brian, I still have every album I ever bought I've never gotten rid of them. So yes,
Yeah. I sadly, after many years, I got rid of my 78s because they were threatening to fall through the floor.
yes,
But but the point is that music wasn't always, kind of handed to you on a silver platter, and it also was made in a different way. I mean, it's hard to believe. I mean, think about Sun Studios, right? And Elvis's first records, or Big Mama Thornton. Like, there was nothing in that room, right? What? A microphone, probably what, a single track or a two-track tape recorder? If they no, it would have been a single track tape recorder, right? Because they didn't bring stereo in for a while. And we still can't get over how amazing that music was,
right.
right? And now we can't get over how amazing the music isn't,
Right. Exactly.
but still, creates. And at the same time, though, people do care about music because kids are prepared to spend a couple $1,000s and cross the Atlantic to hear Taylor Swift. That's it.
Yes. Yeah, people want to go out and see music. That's very true, and that's one of the areas of the music industry that's done extremely well over the last few years is live performance, and that's exciting to me. That's because that's the one thing that computers can't do. People talk about AI and things like that. Yeah, and you can't fake a live human being, at least not yet, anyways. But
And particularly the stadium concert allows you to create a theatrical as well as a purely
yes,
musical experience.
yeah,
So, I mean, I also worry about how people listen to music. We're too busy, first of all, most of us. So most people listen to music in the background over a pair of earbuds when they're commuting to work, when they're driving, when they're, shopping, whatever.
I had a thing that my dad and I would do together, which is listen to albums. And my dad would buy one of his things after he retired. He would go and go to record stores and look for bootlegs or records that he had never heard before. He'd bring them home, and we'd sit down in our living room, and I'd put on one side, and we wouldn't say a word. We'd sit on opposite sides of the living room and listen. Then I'd get up and flip it over and play the other side of the LP. And we would listen to entire albums together all the time. We did this. This is one of my favorite things. That's when I think of my dad. Those are the first things that come to mind. My dad passed away in 2004, and I loved listening to music with him. It was amazing.
Joe Pass.
Joe Pass.
Yeah.
If you can play like that, you've accomplished something with your life.
Right. Kids, listen, that's anyone who's younger than us, kids. Just try it. Pick a favorite song. Headphones are really good for this because they isolate, right? And just turn off the lights, avoid visual distractions, don't look at your phone. I know it's a monumental effort of the will to turn it over, put it in another room, power it down, and just listen to the same piece 3 or 4 times, excluding everything else so that it's just you and the music and nothing else. And you're going to be amazed. Really, you will be amazed.
I try to, every time I get new headphones, I bring my kids down here and I get them to tell me how they sound. And it's fascinating to see them focus on trying to hear the difference between them, because this is that deep listening, but I'm doing it. I'm tricking them into doing it. Well, let's listen to something else. What do you think? How does this sound compared to this? And then they're putting on the headphone, they listen, they're closing their eyes. And
I'm addicted to headphones. I love having many different pairs and now earbuds, anyway, you made a pretty daring decision with your channel early on because you felt the need to illustrate the music you talk about and play it on your channel, and willingly accepted horror of horrors demonetization, occasionally takedowns, and more recently copyright strikes. Now, for listeners who don't know about how all this works, can you explain what this means and how there's like the stake through the heart of the vampire to YouTubers to get demonetized or get 3 strikes? and how this has actually affected some of your most popular videos. I mean, that really takes some cojones to do.
Yeah, I realized early on that you have to weigh this thing. It's like, okay, the way you make money from the videos is by views. It's not your subscribers, it's by views. But if you play music in there, it's going to get claimed, and you get an email that says copyright claim, and it goes on the video. So the people that write the music, unless you claim fair use, if it's a fair use, and they determine that it's fair use, which
Or it's Bach or Dowland.
that's right. They then the person that wrote the music, even if you use 20 seconds of it in your video, in a 20-minute video gets demonetized, and that record label, it's usually not the artist, they never see a cent of it, and they make all the money from your videos. So I realized that early on, it's like, well, I'm not going to avoid playing music, because the only way you can demonstrate something is by playing the music. So I'm going to just not make money from the videos if they got content ID claims or copyright claims. And the only things that would make me go and make videos is when the videos got taken down. And that was really, I get angry about that. And they've YouTube and the record labels have really changed since I started back in 2016. And now you just get content ID claims and stuff. They almost never block your videos, and the copyright strikes. I've only ever gotten one actual strike. I'm trying to think what it was for, but they removed it. I don't remember what it was for. I got one copyright strike though in my entire channel, and they last for 90 days. And if you get 3 copyright strikes within a 90-day period, they take your channel down.
Forever and
It's
ever.
happened
Forever and ever.
Forever and ever. They delete your channel. And I've seen people's channels get deleted. I've seen people that I don't know that come up on they would be on Twitter or something like that, or somebody would tell me about it, and YouTube is very good about working to try and not have that happen. As a matter of fact, I mean, in the last few years, I don't know of anyone's channels that's gotten taken down. I mean, maybe the people at YouTube are fantastic about that. They will help you figure it out. So,
Well, this is actually very interesting. I mean, you talk about fair use. In Canada, we call it fair dealing. It's a similar concept. You're using it for educational purposes or for critical comment, et cetera, all of which I think you could argue is the case for many of these videos that have been demonetized. The other thing that if I can express an opinion, those videos are 95% Beato and 5% clips, right? As far as I'm concerned, it's a derivative work. It's a composite work, as well as a fair use. But also the fact is that when you feature a song, you probably generate a minimum of 100,000 fresh streams for that piece of music. If it's a classic, people think about it again. They haven't thought about it in years. They go back and listen to it. If they're younger people and they've never heard it before, they get curious and they go and listen to it. So you should be getting a royalty from them for a free marketing service. I mean, I last point, you talked a bit, and I think you showed a little bit of Don Henley from the Eagles, who's worth something like $250 million. And he's like staying up at night and investing serious coin in trapping these mice that are infesting his house.
60 people working on his copyright claims 6 days a week. So he said in his congressional testimony in a committee I was on, or in a hearing I was part of where I got interviewed as well. Well, the amazing thing is that I made that John Dowland video I don't know how many views that video's got, millions of views, millions. And I did it. I used to listen to that Julian Bream concert video, and it drove my wife nuts with it. That was on. It's been on YouTube for years and years, but I think it was a Japanese rebroadcast from Japanese TV show, and it wasn't until I told her, Sting actually performed that on his Dowland album, and I played it for her. Oh, I like that. That's way better. Okay, but the idea to do that, it just came up in my YouTube feed, and I used to play it for my son Dylan when he was a baby, and my wife was like, "What is that music?" I'm like, "What are you talking about? It's John Dowland." "Who's John Dowland?" I said, John Dowland is one of the greatest composers of the Renaissance era. And she's like, "What?" Yeah.
That's really interesting because it also deals with something else that you've touched on in your videos, because you've touched on everything, is that, this is music that is basically for lute and a solo voice originally. I mean, in the Bremen consort, it's a mix, or what they call a broken consort. But, originally these are books of lute songs. The lute was a huge, and by the way, we stole the lute. The West stole the lute from an Arab instrument called the oud, which is still played. That was one of the sort of bits of looting that we did during the Crusades.
Looting.
Yes, looting. Exactly. We were. God, it fills me with so much anxiety and grief. I might have to take some lewds. Anyway, sorry. But dynamics, volume, loud doesn't always equate to emotional, because the lute is a very soft instrument. Mm-hmm. Bach's favorite keyboard instrument was the clavichord. That's an even softer instrument.
Clavichord is one of the softest instruments. I interviewed Keith Jarrett at his house, and he played, the first time I went to visit him, to meet him, he played his clavichord for me. And it was amazing how quiet it is. And, I made a video on, that was, I didn't put the video out actually, but it was, where I was talking about the volume of the clavichord, and I couldn't figure out how to do a representation of it. That, you essentially one person, two people could listen to it. You barely can hear it unless you're right next to it. And but I couldn't figure out how to even talk about it, right, let alone get a hold of one. So
yeah, what's cool about the clavichord is it's such a simple instrument. The connection between the key and the string is so direct that you can actually play vibrato.
Yes. There's an album that Keith Jarrett did called Book of Ways. It came out in 1987. That's him playing clavichord, multiple clavichords. He's playing two at once. I think maybe three at once in some pieces. And it's very loud. It's you get an unreal impression of how loud it is, right, until you actually hear it, and you're like, wait, it's that quiet? And it sounds, but it was just mic'd, and
right,
and he just didn't breathe. He told me he was playing and trying not to make any sound at all because they were so loud, the mic pre's were. Andreas Schiff there's an interesting interview with him from probably, I don't know, 2017 or so, and he's talking about the Well-Tempered Clavier, because there's a wonderful version of him where he sits down and plays the first book of the Well-Tempered Clavier front to back at the Royal Albert Hall, I believe it is. In one sitting, it's an hour and 50 minutes, but he talks about, there's an interview with him where he talks about the Well-Tempered Clavier and about the different instruments, and it wasn't necessarily meant to be played on any one keyboard, but he talked about Bach's favorite instrument was the clavichord, but only one or two people can hear it.
Right, exactly.
So you can never play it in concert.
The other thing about Bach that's really amazing is just how prolific he was. I mean, when he was the Thomas Cantor in Leipzig, he had to produce basically an hour of music. Now, write it, orchestrate it, copy it out, all the parts, get the choir and the instrument and the musicians together, rehearse it, and have it ready for Sunday. I can't even imagine.
I can't fathom that, and
For like 20 years.
for 20 years, and also having 20 kids along the way, 2 wives and 20 kids. But it's insanity how much music he produced in his lifetime. I mean,
Well, that's actually something that's always struck me about, one of those unfair then and nows, because there wasn't a music biz in those days. There was either a church that hired you or a royal patron that hired you. And Bach got in trouble with his royal patron early in life and got thrown in the slammer for about a month. Uh, so there were bad boys back then. But anyway, just what it means to be prolific, right? Film music composers are prolific, and they have to be. Some musicians who are very popular are prolific, like for example Prince. Like there's vaults full of stuff that he never released. But the process of generating an album, and nowadays an artist might have 20, 25 albums in their entire career.
if they're lucky, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah. Versus, let's say, I don't know, Schubert, who died at age 27 and produced 500 songs, 9 symphonies, a bunch of string quartets, piano sonatas, a few choral works, and one, and a bunch of other stuff beside. It's like, wow, you could have quality and quantity. What a thought.
Yeah, the lives that these composers lived. I mean, Schubert didn't make it to 30. Mozart made it to what, 35, 36. Beethoven 57, Bach 65, or Beethoven 56, I believe he died before he turned 57. And they were just all of them right until the end.
Right, exactly. And the other thing, of course, is that a lot of them were in acute physical distress.
Yes,
during their most
almost all of them were.
Beethoven, in addition to his deafness, was in excruciating pain most of the final years of his life. If you listen to it's string quartet is number 15, which has this piece where he went to a spa and had remission from whatever was ailing him, and he wrote this exquisitely, unbelievably moving piece that now is called the Heilige Dankesang, the Holy Song of Thanks. Bach wrote his greatest piece really on his deathbed, The Art of Fugue.
Art of Fugue, yes.
After he'd suffered an eye ailment, had, if you can imagine, 18th century eye surgery.
Yes,
and had to dictate the final pieces, and managed to put his own name into the last one, which is unfinished. Okay, so the role of technology from a production standpoint, basically anything is possible now. You can make anything sound like anything. You can create samples of anything. You can make a record without really, as you've said, reading music, knowing much about orchestration, and so on. You've been pretty vocal about that, and also about the downsides of AI. So, it seems to me this is like the greatest double-edged sword in the history of art, that you can have all of these possibilities, and they can basically take away your skills or make your skills unnecessary. So when the time comes that you really need them, you don't have them.
Yeah, that's the era that we're living in right now. We've spanned many different eras, Brian. That and now we're to where computers write songs for us.
Yeah, I brought this just because I know you'd appreciate it, but we went from this, an Edison cylinder. This is 4 minutes of music recorded live by a group, playing down a big room-length horn that created enough energy to drive a cutting needle into a wax master. And they had to play, from start to finish without a mistake, or you threw it away, right?
Right.
And no editing, no mixing, no overdubbing, no nothing, right? And
no.
By the way, the no nothing pretty much lasted until the advent of magnetic tape, which really came into wide use after the Second World War, even though it existed earlier.
Yeah.
So you could actually, do punch outs and, overdubs and multi-tracking and all the rest of it. So it's amazing that anyone wants to listen to those records, but they do. Duke Ellington during the Cotton Club days, like, Find Me Better, right?
Yeah.
And even though it doesn't sound great, remastering has come a long way too, so that's a good thing. But
True.
but you've created, actually, this is kind of a side segue, but you've created courses. It's one of the ways that you made up from demonetization, is that you're back to being an educator again. Everything you really do is educational, but this is really interesting because one of the things that really struck me is that one of your most popular Beato books is ear training. Again, for the non-musicians, please explain what it is and why today it's needed more than ever.
Well, ear training is important for playing with other people, to be able to figure out music with, if you don't have a teacher to teach it to you, you can figure, or a YouTube tutorial. It's the ability to recognize the intervals, distance from one note to the next, whether it's a harmonic interval where they're played simultaneously or a melodic interval where the notes are played separately. If you hear a chord, I talk about things like developing a vocabulary of recognized sounds. If I hear a dominant 7 sharp 9 sharp 5 chord, I know what that sounds like. If I hear a double augmented chord, like C augmented over D flat augmented, I know what that sounds like. And you do this through ear training and be able to dictate. It doesn't. When I was in college, you'd have to dictate melodies. They'd play a melody. You'd have to write out what the note durations were and what the pitches were. Now, that's not so important, but being able to recognize what the intervals are and sound out a melody is incredibly important. If you're improvising, if you're if you're a guitarist and trying to play a solo over something, you hear a melody in your head. Can you play the melody without a mistake by recognizing the intervals? This is why it's so important to be able to do. And hearing a song, when I hear a song, it doesn't matter what it is, I can recognize what the chord structure is. I don't have perfect pitch, but my relative pitch, because that's basically what ear training is teaching relative pitch. Okay, that starts on the 4 chord. That's a 4, 1, 6, 5. Oh, and the 6 chord's actually major, so it's the secondary dominant, things like that. So I've spent a lifetime doing ear training and still do all the time.
And doesn't everybody who becomes a musician get ear training nowadays? That's a leading question, because I assume that they don't, otherwise you wouldn't need to teach it.
Well, what's funny is that we couldn't pass, in college, you could not get a music degree if you couldn't pass sight singing and ear training. And you had 2 years to do that. And if you didn't do that, you couldn't graduate with a music degree. And when I was a professor at Ithaca, I would do these remedial ear training classes, and they were for people that were in danger of not being able to graduate, that were sophomores, and they could not pass. So a lot of my ideas for teaching strategies, how do you teach people that really were not good at it, that had failed at any of the traditional strategies that people taught ear training with? Because where I taught, they didn't use solfege, so they would teach by intervals. And so that's where I developed a lot of the ideas for my ear training course, was through that.
And for people who, I'm sorry to veer back into the classical music world, but in your Leipzig visit, you had a very brief excerpt from one of my all-time favorite Bach pieces, the motet Jesu meine Freude. Now, if you want to hear what ear training makes possible, listen to the harmonies in that piece when
Amazing.
played by a great choir. Or if you want to get even more challenging, listen to some of the Renaissance music where it's continuously moving separate lines. Especially the ones who really focused on making beautiful sounds like Palestrina.
Palestrina, Gesualdo, I mean,
Well, he also made some really ugly sounding
he
chords.
did make some ugly sounding
Yeah,
things, but
intentionally,
it's
intentionally.
it's amazing to think of that these Renaissance composers. So they would go places that that you wouldn't hear that you didn't hear in the Baroque era. Some of it because of the use of modes and things like that, which I think is fascinating. That's why I always loved Renaissance music, just the unpredictability of it.
Absolutely. And I did want to actually mention one of my favorite of your programs, and that's the 20 Greatest Musical Inventions. But I have to say, I think you need to do a part two, because unless I got distracted and missed it, I don't think you mentioned the microphone.
Yeah, microphone. That was definitely an omission by
Yeah.
accident.
Yeah.
Kind of an important thing since I made it using a microphone.
Well, exactly, exactly.
Right.
And it's like, the microphone is really such an amazing device because, first of all, again, a lot of people don't know that there's so many different kinds of microphones. You've got omnidirectional, you've got cardioid, you've got, many, and how you use them is basically the paintbrush, right? It really, probably until you start, digitizing and being able to change it any way you like, the thing that probably affects the sound more than anything else. And it's literally like, the photographer choosing his lens. And yeah, so I love microphones. My partner, who is my record label's chief sound engineer, is like, he like worshipped certain kinds of microphones because they were so beautifully made. They were precision instruments. And so anyway, there's that.
On my last trip to Berlin, I went to the Neumann headquarters and got a tour of Neumann, and I love microphones, and and you're right, they are nothing can change the sound other than changing the instrument like a microphone. A microphone is an equalizer. It's a tone shaping tool that even using the same microphone and just placing it in a different spot can make such a radical
Right.
difference.
I remember when my partner discovered that you could take a pair of Neumann, I think they were U87s, and send them out to this guy who would basically do a custom gold sputtered replacement for the original diaphragm, which made them lighter and more responsive and so on. It's like, oh, it used to be Technicolor. Now it's super Technicolor, right? Uh, you do amazing interviews, and you've interviewed some truly great musicians: Daniel Lanois, Brian May from Queen, Bella Fleck, Brad Moldau, producer Rick Rubin, Steely Dan, George Benson, Keith Jarrett, Pat Metheny, Sting, Seal, Peter Frampton. Um, and one of the things, I mean, I love the fact that you can speak to them as someone who's been in the arena, right? As peer to peer. That means, I think, a lot in getting the most out of them. But I also really love how you did an appreciation of a great interview. That was the one that you did with the great Dick
Dick
Cavett
Cavett.
in
Yeah.
interviewing the great Oscar Peterson, who, by the way, is going to have his 100th anniversary next year. Um, since he's one of
Another
our
Canadian,
yeah,
Toronto native, yes.
and Glenn Gould Prize winner. So
Yep.
so he means a lot to us. We're very good friends with his widow, Kelly. Um, so what is it that really, for you, makes an interview? First thing that I can just suggest from watching you is just the joy of it, right? Like you're like a kid in a candy shop. You're meeting your legends and the people you admire a lot. But there's a lot more that goes into it than that. So how do you prep for an interview?
So, first of all, I only interview people that I either admire or that I'm friends with. And sometimes they're both. There are people that I'm friends with that I admire. And when I think the most important thing for me is to listen, because I give people the space, and when I edit the interviews, I don't cut them to bits, and I let the people complete their thoughts. And sometimes when you ask someone a question, I remember I had Andy Summers, the guitarist from the Police, in here, and I don't know if Andy's ever done an interview as long. It was an hour and a half or so, and I'll usually ask a question, and then when they think I'm going to interrupt, I don't, and I sit there, and then and it happens with everyone. And when I don't interrupt, then they have an idea for, oh, okay, so I can keep going, and then they do, and I think that in addition to knowing what the songs in each album were, who produced them, who engineered them, who mixed them, I can play all the parts on just about every album. Not Pat Metheny or Brad Mehldau, a lot of Pat Metheny. I couldn't play any Keith Jarrett, improvisations or anything, but with all the people that are rock musicians, I understand the technical parts of it. I can play all the parts of their songs on all the instruments, and that's a very handy thing when you're interviewing someone that you can really speak the language in that way.
You're doing live shows now, right?
I've done a number of them. Yeah.
Yeah. What happens at one of your live shows?
It's kind of set up like a live stream in a way. I come out and I talk to the audience. I show things on the big screen, and it starts out as a lecture. Then I get audience participation and do song breakdowns. I play. And
do you ever get people mad? Something you said? I've heard some young listeners really take exception to the idea that kids don't love music the way we used to. You've gotten a couple of rebuttal videos posted. So you ever get a sort of a spirited to and fro?
No, not really. And I love it when people have strong opinions about things. I think it's great. When people make videos, if they disagree with what I say, go for it. I love it.
Right.
I love it.
Another thing that I really love is that you explore music that people don't necessarily expect. Like, for example, your Bela Fleck interview, so cool. What an artist.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. You're doing a great service for music, Rick. And I have to say that if people who are now listening and not giving it that level of attention and appreciation, it is such a wonderful universe to explore. And guys like Rick can really be a great starting point. We're gaining so much because we can do so much with technology, but we're losing at the same time. And, man, you're doing so much more to help us keep it alive and recover those parts that have been lost. And I just want to thank you for that.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate it. Yeah. Appreciate you having me on.
Really, it's been great. And thank you for being so generous with your time.
Very welcome.
The Glenn Gould Foundation is a registered Canadian charity, and we rely on the support of arts lovers like you to keep bringing inspiring stories to life. Please consider giving by visiting our website, glenngould.ca, and follow us across social media at the Glenn Gould Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of The Gould Standard.